because they're expecting you to kick their legs, not their head. So, to prevent your opponent from kicking you in the face, you grab both of his ankles at the same time, spread his legs apart, and then step between his legs and onto his face. Once you've smashed his face, you'll usually end up with one foot between his legs and one above his head. From this position, I like to drop a hammer fist into the side of his head. Once more. Now from a different angle. If my opponent places his feet on my legs, as long as the rules permit, I like to grab his legs, open them, and then stomp his face. Now faster. Now I demonstrate how to land a flying punch on a downed opponent. Because you're jumping over the top of your opponent's legs, it can be difficult for him to defend against the technique. If his legs are up, I will either support myself on his knee or on his stomach as I go over. Both work. I will first do it slow. Now a little faster. I can land either in or out of my opponent's guard. Either way works. Obviously, passing his guard leaves you in a more dominant position. Slow movement. Now a little faster. Once more slowly. I can support myself on his knee or on his stomach. Now I will show you a technique for passing the guard of a downed opponent. If I feel I am better on the ground than my opponent, I might use this technique to pass his guard rather than use one of the previous striking techniques. I have my base here, and my opponent wants to pull me into his guard as I go down. So, as I go down, I grab his ankle and force his leg between my legs. If I can pass over his leg, then I reach side control. But if your opponent is game, most of the time you will not be able to immediately pass his guard. In such a case, I will push on his knee here, and then pass my far leg over his leg and reach side control.
Mais uma vez, estou na posição, ele vai querer me colocar na guarda. Eu dropo e entro aqui, fechando esse gancho.
Once in side control, I switch the positioning of my knees to secure a sturdy base. One more time. My opponent wants to put me in his guard as I go down. So I force his leg between my legs, enter, and push on his knee. Next, I straighten my far leg, step over his leg, and reach side control. Once in side control, I switch the positioning of my knees. One more time. I am in the standing position, and my opponent wants to pull me into his guard as I come down. I go to his guard, but I drive his leg between my legs. Pushing on his knee, I extend my far leg, step over his leg, and reach side control. I go to the guard, and then I pass into side control. Now I demonstrate how to attack your opponent's leg from the standing position. If you don't do everything perfect, there is a chance that your opponent will escape and assume the top position. So normally I will use this technique in the last seconds of a round because there is less risk. To execute the technique, I'll grab my opponent's leg and secure it in my armpit. Next, I drive my left knee between my opponent's legs. Before I attempt to finish the submission, I place my right foot on my opponent's stomach to prevent him from coming up. If you allow your opponent to come up, he will escape the submission and possibly obtain a dominant position. Once you drop back, it is possible to finish the submission without turning, but normally I will rotate my upper body and turn my head to put more pressure on my opponent's leg. If you have this submission locked tight, your opponent will tap. Once more. the same submission. Now I will spar with my brother using the techniques I just showed. Now I'll demonstrate ground and pound techniques when you're in your opponent's closed guard, which is when you're between his legs and he locks his feet together behind your back. A lot of times when you're in this position, your opponent will latch onto your hands to prevent you from striking. You have many options for breaking his grips. You can bend your arm to strip his hand away, grab his hand with your opposite hand to prevent him from re-grabbing, and then strike. You can also latch onto his hand and strip his grip away. There are millions of ways. Escape, and then hit. But with each technique, you want to keep your opponent's back pinned to the mat to prevent him from sitting up into you. If he sits up, it will be a lot harder to strike him. You can see if your opponent comes up, it becomes difficult to strike him. To prevent this from happening, I always put my hands on my opponent and press down into him to keep his back pinned. You always want to secure your opponent so he doesn't come up. Even though positioning your arms in this fashion allows your opponent to set up a sweep, he can just as easily sweep you if you allow him to come up. So the most important part is to keep your opponent pinned to the floor. Control his arms and then hit. If he secures your hand or wrist, pull out, grab his hand, and then hit. It is also important to note here that if you use your left hand to keep your opponent's back pinned to the mat, you want to elevate your right knee. This offers you an even better angle to punch your opponent with your right hand. It also increases the power behind your strike. From here I have a great angle to punch my opponent. I can put my entire body into the punch. Even when you are unable to break your opponent's grips on your wrist, you still have an option to strike him. By rotating your arm above the arm your opponent is using to grab, you can land a nice elbow to his face. It is an excellent way to strike him even when he has your arms under control. When you manage to break your opponent's grip on your arm and then secure his arm to his chest, you can also throw an elbow strike to his thigh. You can go high to his face or you can go low to his thigh. Just like it is when you are standing, going low is a good tactic for setting up a high strike. So here I elbow my opponent's thigh and then I go to his head with the punch. So there are many ways you can use punches and elbow strikes when in your opponent's guard, such as lifting a leg and striking over the top. If your opponent secures your hand, you can break his grip with elbow movement, grab his hand to prevent him from re-grabbing, and then throw a punch. Or you can grab his hand, strip away his grip, and then punch. You can also throw your elbow over the top, putting your whole body into the strike. You can also elbow your opponent's thigh to set up a punch to his head. Remember, hitting low will draw your opponent's focus low, allowing you to go high with your next strike. The thigh, the head.